Hey there, my name is Maya and I'm 24 years old. If you've ever struggled with learning a new language, especially English, then you're not alone. I've been exactly where you are, feeling frustrated, nervous and unsure if I'd ever be able to speak English with confidence. But what if I told you that everything changed with just one decision? In this story, I'm going to share how I went from being terrified to speak English to actually connecting with people through the language, and how you can do it too. When I first started learning English, I could barely string a sentence together. Every time I tried, my mind would go blank, and I'd panic. I'd practice in front of the mirror, whispering to myself, but it never felt real. The words seemed to slip away from me just when I needed them. I was stuck in that frustrating cycle for months, studying vocabulary, watching videos, but never actually using the language in real life. One day I realized that watching videos and memorizing words wasn't going to make me fluent. It was time to take action. So I made a promise to myself. I would speak in English every single day, no matter what. The first time I spoke to someone in English, my heart was racing. I had to go to a cafe to meet a friend, and when I arrived, I saw a foreign tourist sitting alone. I knew this was my chance, but the thought of approaching them made my stomach twist. What if I made a mistake? What if they couldn't understand me? But I remembered my promise. I walked up to them and said, "Excuse me, do you need help with the menu?" I felt my face go red as the words left my mouth. To my surprise, the tourist smiled warmly and replied in English. It wasn't perfect, but it was a conversation. And from that moment, something shifted. I realized that it wasn't about speaking perfectly. It was about speaking at all. After that day, I made it my goal to speak to at least one person in English every day. Some days it was easy, like when I spoke to a friend who was learning English too. Other days it was harder. I'd be at the grocery store trying to ask for directions, and my words would jumble up in my head. But every time I tried, I felt a little braver. The fear that once held me back started to fade away, bit by bit. I also started listening to English podcasts and watching TV shows without subtitles. At first I understood almost nothing, but over time the words began to sound familiar. I could pick up on phrases and sentences. I noticed myself understanding the language even when I wasn't actively trying. The more I practiced, the easier it became to recognize patterns in speech. It was a moment I'll never forget. I was at a family gathering, just a regular Sunday afternoon. The smell of delicious food filled the air, and everyone was chatting away in the living room. But something felt different this time. As I walked into the room, my cousin Sarah, who had been living abroad for the past few years, called out to me. She was sitting on the couch, her phone in hand, scrolling through pictures of her recent travels. Normally we spoke in our native language, but today, for some reason, Sarah switched to English. She smiled at me and said, "Hey Maya, how's everything going? How's life treating you?" I froze for a moment. English? I hadn't really spoken much to Sarah in English before. Sure, I knew the basics, but this was different. Her question didn't come with the familiar comfort of speaking our mother tongue. My heart began to race. I could feel the weight of the moment. This was my chance to really speak English. But fear kicked in. What if I couldn't respond? What if I made a mistake? Would she think I was silly? I took a deep breath and reminded myself of everything I'd worked for. I had been practicing every day. I had made mistakes before and survived them. I had learned to be okay with that. So, with a shaky but determined voice, I replied, "I'm doing well, just staying busy with work and studying." My voice didn't sound as confident as I'd hoped, but Sarah didn't seem to notice. She nodded, smiled, and said, "That's great, I'm so proud of you." And just like that, we were talking. in English. The words weren't perfect, and there were moments when I stumbled, but something amazing happened. The more I spoke, the easier it got. The nervousness started to fade away as I realized that this wasn't a test. This wasn't about being perfect, it was about communicating. Sarah didn't care if my grammar wasn't flawless. She was just happy that I was trying, and I was happy to be understood. We talked for almost an hour. We laughed about old family memories, caught up on what had been happening in each other's lives, and even shared our dreams for the future. The more we spoke, the more confident I felt. By the end of the conversation, I was almost surprised by how comfortable I had become. I realized that something had shifted inside me. This wasn't the same anxious person who used to freeze at the thought of speaking in English. I had crossed a line, a point where English was no longer just a subject to study or a test I had to pass. It was a tool, one that I could use to connect, to express myself, and to learn about the world in a new way. But it didn't stop there. That conversation with Sarah wasn't just a moment of success. It was the start of a new chapter in my language journey. I began to see English as something to embrace, not something to fear. I made a promise to myself that I would speak more often, seek out more conversations, and continue to push through any lingering doubts. Over the next few weeks, I took every opportunity to speak English, whether it was talking to friends, chatting with strangers, or even practicing by myself. Each time I noticed something new, I was getting better. I wasn't perfect yet, but I was growing. And for the first time, I felt excited rather than scared when I thought about speaking English. That turning point with Sarah taught me one of the most important lessons in my journey. Fluency doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from being brave enough to try, to make mistakes, and to keep going. It's about progress, not perfection. A few months had passed since that conversation with Sarah, and my confidence was growing bit by bit. I was making progress, but there were still moments where I doubted myself. There were days when I would rehearse sentences in my head, trying to get the words just right, only to forget them the moment I needed to speak. It felt like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but I was learning not to be hard on myself. The important thing was that I was trying, and each attempt was a step toward improvement. One evening, something happened that made everything click. It was a Thursday, and I had been working late, preparing for an English presentation the next day. I was sitting in my room, the soft hum of my laptop in the background, surrounded by papers filled with notes. My mind was exhausted, and the pressure of the upcoming presentation was starting to get to me. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes for a moment. Suddenly my phone buzzed. It was a message from my friend Rena, who I hadn't spoken to in a while. She had moved abroad a few years ago, and we usually kept in touch through occasional texts or voice messages. But this time it wasn't just a casual text. She had sent me a voice note. "Hey, Maya," the message began. "I've been thinking about you lately. How's everything going? I saw your post about the English presentation, and I know you're working really hard on it. I wanted to tell you something that might help." I played the voice note, curious about what she had to say. "I know you're feeling nervous about speaking in English," she continued, "but trust me, you're doing better than you think. The most important thing is not to focus on the mistakes. Focus on the message you're trying to get across." I remember when I first started speaking English every day, I felt like I was constantly messing up. But the more I spoke, the more natural it became. And soon enough, I wasn't worried about perfection. I was just focused on connecting with people. I smiled as I listened to her. I hadn't expected this message, but it couldn't have come at a better time. It felt like exactly what I needed to hear. Rena had always been someone I looked up to. She had learned English from scratch when she moved abroad, and I admired her fluency. But hearing her say that she had been through the same struggles made me feel less alone. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I realized that I was getting caught up in the wrong things. I was obsessing over every mistake, over every little slip of the tongue, but I wasn't focusing on the bigger picture. The goal wasn't to speak perfectly, it was to speak confidently and to communicate. The message, not the grammar, was what mattered most. Inspired by Rainer's words, I decided to take a new approach. The next day I stood in front of the mirror before my presentation, not practicing my lines, but simply talking to myself. I spoke about anything, my plans for the weekend, my thoughts on a book I had been reading, even how I felt about the weather. I didn't worry about my mistakes. I just spoke freely. I let the words flow, even if they weren't perfect. When the time for my presentation came, I was still nervous, but it was different this time. I wasn't obsessing over the little things. I was focused on the message I wanted to share. As I stood in front of my classmates, I spoke with a new kind of confidence. Sure, there were a few moments where I stumbled or paused to think, but it didn't matter. I kept going. I wasn't afraid to make mistakes anymore. I could see the audience reacting positively, nodding and smiling. That was the moment I knew I had made a real breakthrough. I was no longer trying to be perfect. I was just being myself, and that was enough. The feedback I received afterward was surprisingly positive. My teacher complimented me on how clear and confident I sounded, and even some of my classmates told me that they could see how much I had improved. It was a moment of recognition that I hadn't expected. I realized then that I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer just someone who was trying to speak English. I was someone who could speak English. That evening I went back to my room and sat down, reflecting on everything that had led me to this point. I had spent so much time worrying about how I sounded, about every little mistake, that I had forgotten the most important part. Language was a tool to connect, to share ideas, and to express myself. The breakthroughs weren't in the perfect sentences or flawless pronunciation. They were in the moments when I let go of my fear and just spoke. From that point on, I stopped thinking of English as something to be conquered. It became part of my daily life, something I used not just for school or work, but to connect with friends, to read books, and to understand the world better. I still made mistakes, of course, but I wasn't afraid of them anymore. Each mistake was just another step in the journey, another lesson learned, and I was finally excited about what the future held.